The sun clawed at the earth, relentless, turning the plain to a cracked mosaic of dust and despair. Elias Kane's boots scuffed the porch of his sagging cabin, each step kicking up a faint haze that settled on his frayed coat. His hands, calloused and sun-darkened, gripped the splintered railing as he stared at the horizon, a line as sharp and indifferent as a blade. The air smelled of baked sage and something sour, like the memory of rain that never came. His throat burned, not just from thirst but from the weight of silence, the kind that had settled into his bones since Clara's grave took the last of his voice. The cabin behind him creaked under the wind's assault, its warped boards groaning like they too wanted to give up. He hadn't always been this hollow. Once, there'd been laughter here, the clink of tin cups, her soft hum over the fire. Now, the land mocked him, its vastness swallowing every trace of her. Elias squinted against the glare, his eyes tracing the faint trail where wagon ruts had long faded. No one came this way anymore. Not since the fever took half the valley and the rest fled for greener promises. He stayed, tethered to this patch of dirt by a stubbornness he couldn't name. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was punishment. His fingers brushed the knife at his belt, a reflex, as if the land might rise up and demand something more of him. The heat pressed against his chest, each breath a labor. He'd seen men break under less, seen them walk into the desert and never come back. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was halfway there himself. The thought didn't scare him. It just sat there, heavy, like the revolver rusting on the table inside. Then, a sound. Not the wind's whine or the distant cry of a hawk, but something sharper, deliberate. Footsteps, small and uneven, crunching the brittle earth. Elias straightened, his hand tightening on the knife. Two figures emerged from the shimmer of heat, their forms wavering like ghosts. Girls, no older than 12, their dark hair tangled and streaked with dust. Their clothes, worn deerskin and faded calico, hung loose, patched with sweat and grime. One carried a small bundle, clutched tight to her chest, the other leaned into her, limping, her bare feet leaving faint smears of blood on the ground. They stopped a few yards from the porch, eyes wide but unyielding, like deer caught in a hunter's sight. Elias didn't move. He'd seen their kind before, Shoshone, maybe, or Paiute, children of the land his people had carved up and spit out. He didn't speak their tongue, didn't need to. Their hunger spoke loud enough, etched in the hollows of their cheeks, the way their hands trembled even as they stood tall. The older one, her braid fraying like rope, stepped forward. Her gaze locked on his, not with fear but with something fiercer, defiance, maybe, or desperation. She said nothing, just pointed to the younger girl's foot, where a gash wept red into the dirt. Elias's jaw tightened. He could turn them away. Should. He had nothing to give, not food, not kindness, not even words. The cabin was bare, his own stomach a knot of want. But the younger girl swayed, her knees buckling, and something in him cracked, like ice under a boot. He gestured toward the door, a sharp jerk of his head. The older girl hesitated, her eyes narrowing, weighing him. Then she nodded, helping her sister limp forward. Elias stepped aside, the porch creaking under their weight. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the ghost of old fires. He pointed to a chair, its wicker seat half broken, and the girls sat, their small forms dwarfed by the emptiness of the room. The younger one's breath hitched, a soft whimper escaping as she clutched her sister's hand. Elias knelt, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man handling something fragile for the first time in years. He reached for a tin basin, its edges dented, and filled it with the last of his water. The girls watched, silent, as he tore a strip from an old shirt and dipped it into the basin. The younger girl flinched when he touched her foot, but she didn't pull away. The gash was deep, crusted with dirt. Elias worked carefully, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest, the memory of another wound he couldn't clean, couldn't heal. The sun sank lower, painting the walls in shades of fire. Outside, the wind hissed, carrying the scent of sage and sorrow. The cabin's shadows stretched long across the floor, curling like fingers around the girls' small forms. Elias worked in silence, the damp cloth in his hand turning rust-red as he cleaned the younger girl's wound. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she held still, her eyes fixed on her sister's face. The older girl's gaze never left Elias, sharp and untrusting, her fingers knotted tight in her lap. The air hung heavy with the smell of dust and blood, and the faint creak of the cabin's walls felt like the only thing keeping time. He didn't ask their names. Didn't ask why they were here, alone, or what had driven them across the scorched plain to his door. Questions like that belonged to a man who still believed in answers. Instead, he focused on the task, wrapping the girl's foot in the last of his clean cloth, tying it with a knot that wouldn't slip. His hands moved with a sureness he hadn't felt in months, maybe years, as if the act of binding her wound tethered him to something he'd forgotten. When he stood, his knees cracked, loud in the quiet. The girls watched him, their faces unreadable but for the faint flicker of need in their eyes. Elias turned to the corner where a crate held his meager stores, a half-sack of cornmeal, a tin of beans, a few shriveled apples. Not enough for one, let alone three. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the crate, the weight of their hunger pressing against his own. Then he grabbed the apples, their skins dull and wrinkled, and set them on the table. The older girl's hand shot out, snatching one before he could blink, but she didn't eat. She pressed it into her sister's hands, whispering something soft and urgent in a language Elias didn't know. The younger girl bit into the apple, her teeth sinking in with a faint crunch. Juice dribbled down her chin, and for a moment, her face softened, the pain in her eyes dulled by the small mercy of sweetness. Elias looked away, his throat tight. He busied himself with the fire, coaxing a weak flame from the last of his kindling. The girls needed warmth, needed something more than the cold indifference of the world outside. But the fire's glow only deepened the cabin's emptiness, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. His mind drifted, unbidden, to Clara. The way her hands had moved over the fire, sure and gentle, stirring a pot of stew that filled this same room with warmth. The way her laugh had cut through the silence, sharp and bright, like a blade against the dark. She'd been the one to make this place a home, to coax life from the stubborn earth. When the fever took her, it took the heart of him too, leaving only this shell of a man, tethered to a grave and a guilt he couldn't bury. He'd dug her resting place with his own hands, the dirt clinging to his skin like a second sin. He hadn't cried, not then, not since. But the memory of her face, pale and still, burned behind his eyes now, sharper than the fire's heat. The older girl's voice broke the silence, low and halting. "You live alone?" Her English was careful, each word shaped like she was testing its weight. Elias froze, his hand on the poker. He didn't look at her, just nodded once, the motion stiff. She didn't press, but her eyes stayed on him, searching, as if she could see the cracks in his soul. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the loose shutters. The younger girl flinched, her apple half-eaten, her hands trembling again. Elias set the poker down, his movements slow, and crossed to the window. The plain stretched endless under the fading light, the horizon swallowing the last of the sun. He wondered where they'd come from, these girls, what had left them to wander this unforgiving land. A raided camp, maybe. A family scattered by soldiers or sickness. He didn't ask. Their story wasn't his to know, not yet. He turned back to them, his shadow falling across the table. The older girl met his gaze, her defiance softened by exhaustion. "We go soon," she said, her voice firm but brittle, like she was trying to convince herself. Elias didn't answer. He didn't know if he wanted them to stay or to leave, didn't know if he could bear the weight of their need or the silence of their absence. The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the dark. The fire's glow flickered across the girls' faces, carving their features in sharp relief against the dimness. Elias sat across from them, his hands idle on the table, the grain of the wood rough under his fingertips. The older girl's eyes darted to the door every few moments, as if expecting it to burst open, while the younger one clutched the remains of her apple, her bandaged foot curled beneath her. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of their presence. Outside, the wind keened, a low moan that carried the scent of dust and distant storms. Elias's gaze drifted to the corner, where Clara's shawl still hung on a peg, its edges frayed like the memory of her touch. He saw her in flashes sometimes, kneeling by the garden, her hands deep in the earth, or standing at the window, her silhouette soft against the dawn. She'd have known what to do with these girls, what to say. Her voice had been a balm, soothing even the wildest hearts. But Elias had no words, only the ache in his chest and the stubborn instinct to keep moving, one task at a time. He rose, the chair scraping against the floor, and pulled the tin of beans from the crate. The girls watched, silent, as he pried it open with his knife, the metal screeching faintly. He scooped the contents into a pot, the beans sloshing thickly, and set it over the fire. The smell of iron and salt filled the air, mingling with the smoke. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The older girl's shoulders eased slightly, though her eyes stayed wary, tracking his every move. As the beans warmed, Elias's mind wandered back to a winter years ago, when he and Clara had sheltered a drifter caught in a blizzard. The man had been half dead, his lips blue, his story spilling out in fevered fragments: betrayal, a lost wife, a child he'd never see again. Clara had fed him, wrapped him in blankets, and listened without judgment. Elias had resented the intrusion, the way the man's presence filled their home with his pain. But Clara had said, "We don't turn away what's broken." Those words haunted him now, heavy as the pot in his hands. He spooned the beans into 2 chipped bowls and set them before the girls. The younger one hesitated, glancing at her sister, who nodded once, sharp. They ate quickly, their spoons scraping the bowls, the sound loud in the quiet. Elias didn't eat. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the firelight play across their faces. The younger girl's hands shook less now, her breathing steadier. The older one ate with purpose, her eyes flicking up to meet his, holding a question she didn't voice. When they finished, the older girl pushed the bowls aside and spoke, her voice low but clear. "We need a place. One night." Her words were a plea wrapped in pride, her chin lifted despite the tremor in her hands. Elias's jaw tightened. One night could mean more: trouble, obligation, a crack in the solitude he'd built like a fortress. But the younger girl's eyes, wide and glassy, caught the fire's glow, and he saw Clara in them, the way she'd looked at him when he'd first stumbled into her life, half-starved and running from his own ghosts. He nodded, once, and pointed to a corner where a thin pallet lay, covered with a blanket that smelled of dust and time. The older girl stood, helping her sister limp across the room. They settled together, the younger one curling into her sister's side, their breathing soft and uneven. Elias stayed by the fire, the heat licking at his boots, his mind churning. He didn't know their story, didn't know if they'd bring danger to his door, raiders, soldiers, or something worse. But he couldn't shake the image of them out there, alone, swallowed by the plain's endless hunger. The fire died to embers, and the cabin grew still. Outside, the wind settled, leaving only the faint rustle of sagebrush. Elias's eyes drifted to the shawl again, and he wondered if Clara was watching, if she'd approve of this small act of mercy. He didn't believe in signs, not anymore, but the weight in his chest felt different now, less like guilt, more like a tether, fragile but real. The girl's breathing slowed, a quiet rhythm in the dark. Elias stayed awake, his back to the wall, listening to the night. The embers pulsed faintly, casting a dull red glow that barely reached the corners of the cabin. Elias sat, his back pressed against the rough wall, the revolver now in his lap, its weight a cold comfort. The girls slept, their small forms huddled under the blanket, the younger one's breath a soft whistle, the older one's hand resting protectively on her sister's shoulder. The air smelled of ash and beans, the fire's last warmth fading into the chill of the night. Outside, the plain was silent, the wind's howl reduced to a whisper, as if the land itself held its breath. Elias's eyes traced the cracks in the ceiling, his mind pulling him back to a day he'd tried to bury. He'd been younger then, barely 20, riding with men who called themselves justice but acted like wolves. They'd burned a camp, Shoshone, he thought now, though he hadn't cared then. The smoke had choked the sky, and he'd stood by, rifle in hand, watching shadows flee into the dusk. One face stayed with him, a girl, no older than these two, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched a smaller child. He'd done nothing. Said nothing. The memory sat like a stone in his gut, heavier now as he glanced at the girls on the pallet. He shifted, the revolver's grip biting into his palm. He didn't know if these girls were running from something like that, raiders, soldiers, or the slow grind of hunger. Their silence told him enough. The older one's defiance, the younger one's fear, they carried a story carved in loss, same as him. He wondered what Clara would have done, how she'd have drawn their truth out with a gentle word or a warm meal. But Clara was gone, and all he had was this cabin, these walls that held more ghosts than comfort. The older girl stirred, her eyes cracking open, glinting in the ember light. She didn't move, just watched him, her gaze steady but guarded. Elias met her eyes, then looked away, his fingers tightening on the revolver. He didn't want her trust, didn't want the weight of it. But her stare lingered, and he felt it like a question he couldn't answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You got no one?" The words hung there, simple but sharp, cutting through the quiet. Elias's throat tightened. He could have lied, could have said nothing, but something in her eyes, fear and strength tangled together, pulled the truth from him. "Not anymore," he said, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used in years. She nodded, slow, as if she'd expected it. Then she turned back to her sister, pulling the blanket tighter around them. The night deepened, the cabin's walls creaking under the weight of silence. Elias stayed awake, his mind churning with the girl's presence, their need pressing against his own. He thought of the plain outside, its vastness a mirror to his emptiness. He'd built this life to keep the world at bay, to let the pain of Clara's loss harden into something he could carry. But these girls, with their bloodied feet and hungry eyes, had cracked that armor, letting in a sliver of something he wasn't ready to name. By dawn, the embers were cold, and a faint gray light seeped through the window. Elias stood, his joints stiff, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the plain stretching endless under a sky bruised with clouds. He checked the horizon, half expecting trouble, a dust cloud, hoofbeats, anything. But there was only the sagebrush, swaying gently, and the distant cry of a hawk. He turned back to the cabin, his boots crunching the frost-dusted earth. Inside, the girls were awake, sitting up on the pallet. The younger one's face was pale, her bandaged foot still curled beneath her, but her eyes were clearer now. The older girl stood, her braid loose, her hands clenched at her sides. "We go today," she said, not a question but a statement, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. Elias nodded, his chest tight. He didn't know if he wanted them to stay, didn't know if he could bear the silence they'd leave behind. He handed them the last of the cornmeal, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and a canteen with what water he could spare. The older girl took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment, her eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude she didn't voice. They stepped onto the porch, the younger one leaning on her sister, their shadows small against the vastness of the plain. Elias watched them go, the wind tugging at their clothes, the dust rising in their wake. The girls' figures grew smaller against the plain, their steps uneven but deliberate, swallowed slowly by the haze of dust and dawn. Elias stood on the porch, his hands gripping the railing, the wood biting into his palms. The air was sharp with frost, the sagebrush glinting silver under the rising sun. The world felt too big, too empty, and yet the weight of their departure pressed against his chest, heavier than the revolver at his hip. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched until they were nothing but a shimmer on the horizon. Inside, the cabin was quieter than before, the girl's absence a presence of its own. The pallet lay crumpled, the blankets still holding the shape of their bodies. Elias crossed to it, his boots heavy on the floor, and smoothed the fabric with a hand that trembled faintly. The act felt futile, like trying to hold on to smoke. He turned to the fire, now just ash, and the cold seeped into his bones, sharper than the wind outside. He thought of Clara again, her voice soft in his memory, "We don't turn away what's broken." But he hadn't he? Every day since her death, he'd turned away from the world, from himself. He sat at the table, the empty bowls still there, their edges crusted with dried beans. His fingers traced the rim of one, and he saw the older girl's eyes again, fierce, guarded, but searching. She'd asked if he had no one, and his answer had been true, but it felt like a lie now. Those girls, with their blood and hunger, had stirred something in him, a flicker of purpose he'd thought long buried. He wondered where they were headed, what waited for them beyond the plain. A camp, maybe, or a town that might not welcome them. The thought twisted in his gut, sharp as the memory of that burning camp years ago, the girl's face in the smoke. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loud in the silence, and grabbed his coat. The revolver went into its holster, the canteen slung over his shoulder. He didn't know why, not fully, but his feet carried him to the door, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. The plain stretched before him, the girl's tracks faint in the dust, winding toward a low ridge. He followed, his stride long but careful, the sagebrush brushing his legs. The sun climbed higher, its light cold and clear, painting the land in shades of gold and gray. As he crested the ridge, he saw them, two small figures limping along a dry creek bed. The younger one stumbled, and the older caught her, their shadows merging into one. Elias stopped, his breath catching. He could turn back now, let them go, let the plane take them as it had taken so much else. Or he could keep going, risk the vulnerability of caring, of hoping. His hand rested on the revolver, not for threat but for comfort, a reminder of the man he'd been, hard, solitary, safe. The older girl turned, sensing him, her eyes narrowing across the distance. She straightened, her hand on her sister's shoulder, and for a moment, they just stared, the wind whispering between them. Elias raised a hand, not a wave but a gesture, open and uncertain. The girl didn't move, but her face softened, just a fraction, like a crack in stone letting light through. He took a step forward, then another, the dust rising around his boots. The girls waited, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. He didn't know what he'd say when he reached them, didn't know if he'd offer shelter or just walk with them a while. But the act of moving, of choosing, felt like a rope thrown across a chasm, fragile but enough to hold. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling across the plain, warming the earth where frost had lingered. The sagebrush swayed, its scent sharp and clean, and the distant hawk cried again, its voice carried on the wind. The creek bed wound through the plain like a scar, its dry stones glinting under the climbing sun. Elias's boots crunched against the gravel, each step a choice he hadn't named yet. The girls stood still, their figures small but unyielding against the vastness, the older one's hand tight on her sister's arm. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and something sharper, sweat, fear, maybe hope. Elias slowed as he neared, his shadow falling long across the stones, his heart a heavy rhythm in his chest. The older girl's eyes locked on his, her gaze a blade honed by survival. She didn't speak, but her stance, feet planted, chin high, said enough. The younger one clung to her, her bandaged foot hovering above the ground, her face half hidden behind her sister's shoulder. Elias stopped a few paces away, his hands open at his sides, the revolver's weight a cold anchor at his hip. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if words could bridge the distance between them. The plain stretched around them, indifferent, its silence louder than the wind. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. "You got a place to go?" His voice was low, cracked from disuse, but it carried. The older girl's eyes narrowed, weighing him again, her fingers tightening on her sister's arm. She didn't answer right away, and the pause felt like a test, one he wasn't sure he'd pass. Finally, she shook her head, a small, sharp motion, her braid swaying like a pendulum. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. He glanced at the horizon, where the ridge met the sky, a line as unyielding as his own solitude. He thought of Clara, her hands gentle on a stranger's fevered brow, her voice saying, "We don't turn away what's broken." He'd turned away so many times, from her memory, from the world, from himself. But these girls, with their bloodied feet and defiant eyes, had cracked something open, and he couldn't look away now. "Come back," he said, the words simple but heavy, like stones dropped into still water. The older girl's face didn't change, but her shoulders eased, just a fraction. She glanced at her sister, whose eyes were wide, searching her face for guidance. The older girl nodded, slow, and took a step toward him, helping her sister limp forward. Elias turned, leading the way back to the cabin, his steps measured, the girl's soft footfalls behind him. The sun hung higher now, its light spilling across the plain, warming the dust and sage. The cabin came into view, its sagging roof a dark smudge against the gold of the morning. Inside, Elias set to work, his hands moving with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He boiled water, mixed the last of the cornmeal into a thin gruel, and set it before the girls. They ate in silence, their spoons scraping the bowls, the sound a quiet rhythm in the room. As they ate, Elias stood by the window, watching the plain. He thought of the grave out back, the earth still raw where Clara lay. He'd stood there so many times, his hands stained with dirt and guilt, believing the world had nothing left for him. But now, the girl's presence filled the cabin with a warmth he didn't trust, a fragile hope that scared him more than the emptiness ever had. The older girl finished first, pushing her bowl away. She looked at him, her eyes softer now, but still guarded. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, the word carrying a dozen questions. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked at the shawl on the peg, its edges catching the light, and felt Clara's presence, not as a ghost but as a quiet strength, urging him forward. "Because I ain't alone no more," he said finally, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. The girl nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line, and turned back to her sister, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Outside, the plain stretched endless, but the sun's light felt different now, less like a curse and more like a promise. The sagebrush swayed, and the wind carried a faint sweetness, like the memory of rain.